man, the feedback.
The feedback. If you can't tell, we don't have our amps and ISO cabs, and we're not going direct today. We have amps right here.
Literally right here.
PV Classic 30 and a Fender Mustang 1, just because today's lesson topic is how to set up your amp, right?
Setting up amps.
Setting up your amp. And welcome to this week's Guitareo Live lesson, by the way.
Welcome.
And this is, I guess, it's not really a philosophical lesson, but it's not so academic or instructional from a musical point of view, but it is very important for everyone to know how to set up their amps, especially if you're just starting to get into electric guitar, if you want to, and you're kind of intimidated because, like, tube amps are expensive and heavy and loud. Solid state and modeling amps have so many options on them that I don't know, which one to buy, first of all. Second of all, once I get it, how do I set it up and make it sound halfway decent, right?
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot to go through.
It's fairly intimidating. And make sure you download the PDF in the download section. Download that, and it's going to kind of cover all the points that we go through in this lesson. We might disagree on things. So you did say philosophical. We might disagree.
Yeah, for sure.
I haven't actually read over your points.
I read his. So
I don't know what you're saying. Okay.
The first point is, what do you want to sound like? And this is kind of, again, a little bit more philosophical, or at the very least, highly subjective, because everyone's different. Do you want to have a clean sound, like jazzy blues, a little bit less gain, more clean tone, right? Yeah. Or do you want a dirtier tone? Are you into metal and really aggressive hard rock? If you buy an amp that's meant for clean tones and you want to play hard, heavy rock or metal on it, you are going to be disappointed and you're going to struggle with your amp every time you sit down to get a good tone with it. And the same thing is the other way. If you buy, what did I just say?
You buy like a high gain amp.
Yeah, if you buy a high gain amp and you're trying to get really jazzy and mellow, clean tones out of it, some amps, metal amps on the clean channel can do it, but it's probably not gonna be the flavor you want to go with.
Yeah, that's what I would say. You can get clean.
Yeah, you can get clean. Yeah,
it's not gonna necessarily be the sound, especially if you're talking about jazz. Like that's a completely different rabbit hole that we can talk about in a little bit too. So,
cool. I guess that's the first point is just sit down and really think, what kind of tone am I shooting for? Cleaner, middle of the road, or dirtier? And keep that in mind as you start to learn things about amps.
And I will interject quickly, because one of the things I know a lot of guitar players want to cover 100 bases. So it's not always just one sound that you want to get, right? Sometimes you want to do, I want to be able to play jazz, I want to be able to play blues, which those two types of kind of cleanish are very different, require very different types of amps for the most part. Maybe you also want to play metal, maybe you're into everything. And then in that case, there's kind of options for you too. I would just say you can get something that does one thing exceedingly well. You can get something that does a bunch of things fairly well. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. There's lots of amps that do a good job of that.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Probably my number one tip for dialing in a good tone is to use moderation. And by that I mean, don't max anything out to 12, or don't turn something completely off. I've had a lot of metal guys take the treble out of their a lot of shredders take the treble out of their guitar just to cover up any mistakes. It's kind of like hitting the neck pickup. And a lot of guys who play on their own a lot, and I was guilty of this, like when I first started playing, a lot of guys who play on their own a lot crank up the bass to make it feel like they're playing with a full band, or make it feel like a bass is playing with them, but that can really flab out your sound and make it really muddy sounding. Another thing is, a lot of people that I've seen get into amps initially is they crank the gain up really high to get sustain, when if they focus a little bit more on their technique, you don't need all of that gain. So moderation and gain and bass to me are two really important things. Just use enough gain to where you can get by and you can make the sound you want without it getting flabby. And I'll give you a really good example of that. Let's see, I'm gonna take this boost off. And let's go to the gain channel on this amp. This is the regular, straight, very simple, classic 30 PV.
A lot of people have that amp.
A lot of people have it. And like a Blues Junior or a Hot Rod Deluxe, pretty much the same thing as far as functionality.
Circuitry, they're almost the same.
Yeah, so you can see that I'll just go through some gain chit-chat for you while we're here too. When you have a 2-channel amp like this, when you have a normal or a clean channel, which this knob right here controls the volume on your clean channel. I'll just switch over to that real quick, let you hear it. So this is a clean channel. Okay. If I turn that up, it just gets louder until it starts to break up, And then the channel button switches over to the gain or drive channel, which you're probably gonna have 2 knobs on a drive channel. Sometimes you'll have that on a clean channel too. It really depends what's going on with the particular amp you have. But the pre-gain can either be labeled pre-gain Or what are some other names for it? That's pretty much
I mean,
either gain or pre, right?
A lot of times people will even just call it volume.
Yeah,
Right?
volume,
Because it's basically the first gain stage that your amplifier's kind of going through in the preamp.
Right. And if you have that, you're going to have either what they're going to call a volume or master
Yeah.
volume knob, which in this case is called post.
Okay. Yeah.
That's like your volume. This is your gain or your distortion, right?
Yeah.
How much your amps you're going to push it to break up. And you can see that this is fairly distorted.
Yeah.
It's a good rhythm sound. And my gain, my pre-gain or gain is only on 7. Now what I meant by using moderation when you're setting up your amp is a lot of people are like, I'm playing metal, I'm going to do this. And it sounds really heavy, but I think it loses a lot of definition.
It does. Of course it does.
What I would do is back that off.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit more if you're really playing really aggressive stuff. Right? Instead of this. It gets a little flabby.
And one thing I will mention is the type of pickups that you're using are not even doing justice the point you're making. With humbuckers, it's going to smooth off the top even more, and you're going to notice that even more. It's going to be pretty dramatic.
Yeah, these are fairly low output too. So like if you have I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but if you have your guitar, if you have a guitar that's appropriate for what the style of music you want to play, it's going to help you a lot as far as setting your amp up. Like, I would never play that kind of music at a gig on this guitar.
No.
Right?
Yeah,
So
exactly. But we'll get to that, right?
We'll get to that, yeah. So moderation in that regard. Another thing is just moderation, like with your EQ. So on this particular amp, I have treble, middle, and bass. And check it out. This is a really dark guitar. There's not a lot of high end in it.
Okay.
So my treble is it's on 9. That's probably the highest I would generally ever go on this amp with any guitar. But this is the darkest guitar that I own.
That's 9 out of, or is that on the clock?
That's 9 out of 12.
Okay, so you're almost at what would you say that is on a clock?
230.
Okay.
Yeah. And my middle is straight up in the middle, which is pretty much where it lives unless I'm playing a Strat, then I crank it a little bit.
Okay.
Or a Telly. And then my bass is backed way off because this is a dark guitar.
Right.
Now, a lot of people, myself included, when like I said, when I first started playing, I wanted a really full sound. So I would, let me actually boost this so I can get it. It's really full, but it's really bassy sounding. If I was playing with that in a band, it'd get lost a lot.
Oh, yeah.
So what I would do is maybe back that off. And that's still really bassy, so let me take this boost off. I'll tell you more about that later. Okay. That's much more appropriate for in the context of a band, which Andrew will get to later in some of his points.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Sounds really good.
So just keep that in mind. If you find yourself maxing out a knob, either kind of reevaluate the tone you're shooting for, or reevaluate the guitar you're using for that particular tone.
Yeah, I'd agree. Unless you can find reference points, this isn't a point that I was going to make, but I'll just say it anyway. The main amp that I use, my Dr. Z that I love, not this one, but a different one, you actually turn the bass knob to 0. You literally turn it to 0. And it's because, for some reason, the way that they designed that circuit, there's so much bass.
I have an amp like that at
Okay,
home.
yeah, and you turn it to 0 and you bring it up just
a little
so
bit,
that it's like, okay, that's enough bass. And it's weird because there are amps that are like that.
Yeah, I have a Gibson Lab Series L5 at home.
Okay.
That B.B. King was famous for using
Right,
like forever, and
right.
then Ty Tabor King's X was famous for using. And that thing, if you get the bass above 2, a lot of messy boogies are like this too. If you get the bass above 2, they just flab out. So
Yeah. And that's not 2 o'clock. That's
2 like
on the
1,
dial.
2, yeah. So just be careful of that.
Holy cow. Okay, so the next one here. Okay, this is a really big one for me, and it's a bit of a pet peeve, and that's choosing the right wattage. This has to do a lot more, I would say, with tube amplifiers more than anything else. The problem with tube amplifiers is they are so loud. If you get a 1 watt tube amp, 1 watt, and you turn that thing up, it'll be too loud for your house. It is so loud.
How loud is your solid state amp over there right now? What does it crank to?
I have it at 7.
I have mine almost on 2.
Yeah, and it doesn't even turn on until almost 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there's no volume until it's almost
like
at 2. And all of a sudden it's like boom.
Yeah.
And that's a 30 watt amp, I believe,
Yes, 30
right?
watts.
30 watts.
I've never had it above 3 to gig.
Yeah, right? Okay, and that's one thing that is so important is you need to think about, and I was going to say, this is not the best amp for what we're doing.
No,
This is not
it's
an
a
amp you want to buy
nuisance.
for this, in this room, what we're doing, it's not good. If you wanted to play at a coffee shop, not good amp.
It's terrible.
Because the thing with tube amps is that they just sound so much better when they're louder. They don't have to be distorting, they don't have to be overdriving, but just the louder you get, it creates more tube compression. It's going to sound a lot better. So I see so often, especially with things like, I mean, the Blues Junior is an amazing amp, but it's 15 watts. 15 watts is super loud, and people don't think about that, right? And there's other factors that factor in to how loud an amplifier is, the speaker, and just even the circuit type is gonna have a huge effect, but especially with Fender. Fenders are just known for being super loud. So when you're buying an amp, when you're picking an amp, whatever it is, and if it's gonna be tube amp, just think about, are you gonna be playing big gigs? Because for me, like, even when I've played like the biggest gigs possible, 50 watts has been overkill. One of my amps, 50 watts. It's like, I can crank that thing, and it's like, it'll tear your head off.
I've never owned an amp over 50 watts. Most of the ones I've owned have never been over 30.
Yeah.
So.
So I would recommend, there's amps out there that are kind of like the 0.5 to 5 watts. Those are,
Those are
awesome for practicing home. And they
what is it?
sound
What is
awesome.
the Epiphone one that has?
Oh, yeah.
that one's
I can
great.
picture it in my head, but I
It's a
don't remember
tube,
what it's
all
called.
tube amp, one power tube, I think. But
Yeah.
it sounds great. It's great for home use.
Yeah, exactly. So just be thinking about that. If you want to go out and buy a twin or something like that, that is okay. That is perfectly okay. But just remember, if you're going to be playing at home, you're not going to be getting the most out of it, right? So one of the great things you can do, though, and a lot of people don't know this, is that tube wattage and solid state wattage are completely different things. And so tube wattage, what's like 30 watts over here, equivalent volume is like 200 watts in solid state. So if you get like a 20, 30, 40, 50 watt solid state amp, you're gonna be totally fine. Also, solid state, and the same with modeling amps, they don't tend to be so important with how much you turn the amplifier up. No. Even at quieter volumes, they're still gonna sound really good.
I prefer practicing on like a good solid state amp, like that line 6 amplifier.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people prefer when they're practicing at home and stuff like that, unless they have a very specific setup or something like that where they can mic the amp and stuff. It's not always going to sound as good. This amp I'm using, how many watts is the Mustang?
You know, I don't even know. It's probably 20, maybe 15,
something like that,
20,
right?
30.
Yeah, and it's plenty loud enough. But it's not overkill. A 20 watt tube amp would just be tearing our faces off if I had it where this is at.
It'd be a headache level, right? I was gonna say, oh, Valve Junior is the Epiphone amp that you might want to check out. Yeah.
Valve Junior. Cool. Yep, nice.
Next point is consider which guitar. Consider your guitar when you're dialing in your amp. I have this amplifier, go to a clean tone, set up pretty good for this particular guitar, which, like I said, is very dark in general. Right, and here's the bridge pickup. My treble is really high, moderate mids, and very rolled off on the bass, just because it's such a dark guitar. Now I'm gonna switch to my Strat.
Okay.
And this is gonna poke your eyeballs out, just because it's gonna be
just
so
what I
bright.
always ever wanted.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the reason for this is generally humbuckers have more bass and they're just more robust sounding. So you're gonna set your amp accordingly, not as much bass, maybe a little bit more treble, maybe. Single coils don't have as much output generally, and they're gonna be a lot brighter generally. These are like super traditional pickups in this guitar, so it's a good example. Listen to this. Exact same settings. Nothing changed. Here's the neck pickup. That sounds okay, but generally, my Strat normally lives on 7 or 8 on the tone. Even then, that's still really bright. So backing your treble off, like even maybe to here, maybe not quite that far. That sounds pretty good. I would crank the middle and the bass a little bit just to give it a little more body content.
Sounds more like a Strat. Sounds better.
Sounds appropriate.
Yeah.
If you want a little more spank,
Bring up the tone knob, use it
yeah,
there,
later
yeah.
tone. But I almost never have my tone knob on my Strat on, all the way.
I usually keep mine at 7, and then I still will bring it up if I'm doing like country stuff or
Yeah,
something like
exactly.
that, right?
So one good little experiment, if you have like a tube amp or something that's not modeling based, even if you do, is to turn all of your EQ down. And here it is. Just the volume up. Then I would take my treble Dial that in. Yeah, a little bit harsh.
Okay.
Then take my mid, dial it in. And then fill in the rest with a bass. You can feel it get kind of woofy there. And that's how I would set this for this guitar.
Right.
So that's one method that I like to use, at least for a clean tone, just to dial in a good sound.
Nice.
Starting point.
Nice. Okay, next point. Volume doesn't always make you louder. So there's a couple kind of points within this point. So the first one being, a lot of people think when they're playing with a band, this is more specific to people playing with a band, it does matter if you're playing the jam tracks, but you're not going to care as much. Turning yourself up isn't always going to make people hear you better. And a lot of people think, oh man, you couldn't hear my solo? Okay, let me go turn up and I'll be louder so you can hear my solo. And all that's going to do is going to make the person in the front row's ears hurt, but they're not going to be able to figure out why it's hurting. It's just going to be this huge wash of noise. Oftentimes, what makes guitars poke through, or any other instrument, is like their frequency, right? So when we use EQ on an amplifier, we're actually carving out our little spot in the mass frequency. You think about it, bass guitar is covering that bottom end, right? And you've got your guitar, which is supposed to be covering like the mid-range a little bit more, right? And then you have like cymbals and vocals are covering all the top stuff and the other parts of the mids and stuff like that. So when you're EQing your amp, especially when you're gonna play in a band, you really need to keep that in mind. And that's one of the reasons, like I said, I turn my bass all the way down on that one amp. I have another amp, I don't turn my bass all the way down, but I still have it super low. Because what happens is when I'm sitting at home, a lot of the times, taking a bunch of the mids out, turning up the treble and the bass sounds really good.
Really good, yeah.
It sounds big and clean,
Yeah.
especially with like clean amps, and it just sounds beautiful. But you go and you get in a band setting, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I actually can't hear myself. I'm super loud, I can't hear myself. It's a weird phenomenon. It doesn't make sense unless you kind of try it. But all of a sudden, you take some of that top end off, you take most of the bottom end off, because the bass is gonna cover all those frequencies. You bring your mids up, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm poking through. I can hear myself. And that's one of the reasons too why like a tube screamer was so popular with so many amps for so long, because when you clicked it, it literally just rolled off your bass and boosted your mids. And it just made you poke through the mix. So you're not necessarily getting louder, you're just making your tone kind of fit the rest of the context a little bit better, is kind of the idea.
You're standing at the part of the conveyor belt when you pick up your baggage where there's no people. So
Yes.
you can reach your baggage.
Yes.
I was on 8 airplanes this weekend, so that's what I'm going to take.
That's a good reference. And then one other thing, which has to do with volume, and again, something a lot of people don't know, is if your volume, let's say, starts at 0 and let's say it ends at 10, right? 0 all the way to 10 is not going to be a linear volume change. What happens is at a certain point, and this is especially the case for tube amplifiers, at a certain point on your volume, you've reached maximum volume. This is usually at like 4 or 5 on a lot of amps. I know on my amps, it's one of them is about 6 and the other one's about 4. And at that point, what happens is the amp starts to compress and you start to get like natural overdrive. And what happens is as the amplifier compresses and you get more and more overdrive, you actually get lost more and more in a mix again. So you want to make sure you don't have so much gain, because that just smooths everything out and you just become basically this washed out thing that just sits in
like
the mix.
white noise.
Exactly, exactly. So turning up the volume, like I said, isn't always going to make you louder, and that's kind of 2 ways it's not going to make you louder. Okay, go on.
Next thing for me is how do you want to achieve your sound? And I think this is going to help a lot of people out there who have a little bit of experience with electric guitar, but haven't really found their sound or don't really know how to experiment per se. And the 3 basic ways to achieve your sound are to go with a straight clean sound and go from there, build things on there. Either you can manipulate your guitar or throw pedals on top of that to make different sounds. You can start with a just barely pushing or starting to break up what we call a crunch sound, where you can kind of hear that there's a little overdrive being added and then use that for your palette. That's what I like to do.
Right.
And then you can use just, instead of using pedals or anything like that, you can use just the gain on your amplifier. Like I'll give you, it's easiest if I just go through this and give you some examples rather than trying to explain it to you. But those are the 3, clean, kind of pushed or crunch, and then using all the gain on your amplifier. So I have my clean tone here. I like the way it sounds. On this amp, I use this a lot just as a clean channel palette, super clean when I'm playing like country or church gigs.
Right.
Stuff where I don't need a ton of gain. Sorry, that's really out of tune, but the idea for this is like if you like a clean tone and that's really important to you, this is a really good fundamental place to start. And then you can add, if you want to, things on top. I have reverb on my amp, but you could have a reverb pedal. It's really nice. And I have a soul food, electroharmonic soul food, just for an overdrive pedal that you can use. Right? I tend to not like that as much as a pushed amp for adding overdrive pedals. But if that's where you want to live and that's where you want to start, that's great. It's a great kind of ground zero to experiment with. What I do like to do, and not so much on this amp, just because it's not as good for it, is have like the gain channel, or if you have like an amp with a master volume and a volume, I like to set what would be the pre or the volume just to where the amp is starting to break up. And on this amp, that's pretty low because this is more like a gain knob than a preamp. So it's just a little bit gaining. And if you want to clean it up, you can roll off on your master.
Is that the volume on your guitar, right?
Yeah. And again, this isn't the best example of this amp, but this is the way I prefer to do things.
Right.
And oftentimes, like if I have two overdrive pedals, I'll leave one on all the time on the clean channel on this amp, just to get it to break up a little, and that'll be kind of my bass palette. But here, just a little bit of gain, and then when you kick an overdrive in, it's a little bit, what's a lot of reverb? It's a little bit more aggressive and sustaining, which I like, without being, you know, like hardcore metal or anything like that. The next way would be getting all your gain from your amp.
Right.
So I'm gonna turn that back down. I had my preamp gain, or the gain on this, or the volume on my lead channel up to around 7 a while ago, and I will just turn that up to where it's a comfortable volume. And this is not a metal amp by any chance, but that's pretty rocking. And this is not a metal guitar by any chance, but it's pretty rocking. And then, like if I was playing a hard rock gig, and I would still use the same overdrive pedal, it's totally fine. And that sounds great. So this amp, short of anything that's metal, I would say I've got my bases covered. Even if I were to use that pedal back there, that tube zone, that thing it will make pretty much any amp sound
screams
metal.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
pick or experiment with all three of those. Start with just a straight clean sound, stack some pedals on there if you want. If you have an amp where you have like a master volume and then a gain knob, push it just to where it's breaking up and then experiment with your pedals. And then if you have an amp that has more high gain, just use that, because you get, to me, it's a different feel using the gain on an amp than it is using the gain through pedals.
That's right. One tiny interjection I do want to make. For those of you guys that are kind of wondering where to invest your money when you're building a rig, and you do plan on using a real amplifier, the amp is the #1 thing, in my opinion, that you should spend your money on, even more so than a guitar. For people who are really interested in like having good tone, it's better to have a really high quality amp and a cheaper guitar. If you were to listen to the difference with a cheaper guitar or a more expensive guitar and a cheaper amplifier, you get way better sound. If I plugged like a Squire into my nice gear, I would get almost the same tone. It would be very little difference.
If you plugged that $2,500 guitar into the little $3,000 guitar into like a Fender Frontman 10 watt, it would still sound very cheap.
That's absolutely correct. And that's why we had a hard time kind of getting this thing to sound good, the Mustang, right? Because it's a little bit more inexpensive, but with enough kind of tweaking and stuff, we actually got it to sound pretty good. So that kind of leads me into the next point, which is think about context. And I kind of touched on this in my last thing that I was talking about, but really think about who you're playing with, what other instruments you're playing with, or lack thereof, right? Or are you playing with no instruments? If you're playing solo, you can do something very, very different with your guitar tone and what you're going for, EQ-wise especially, than if you were playing with another guitar player. Or let's say there's no other guitar player and it's just drums and bass, then you do something different. So you really have to think about it that way. Now I'm gonna show you, if I go over here, if I can reach, you can see how I have the settings set. So this amplifier actually has no mids. no mid control, which is pretty tough. It made it hard to kind of dial it in a little bit.
I told Andrew you can tell if your amp is expensive or cheap if it doesn't have a mid knob.
So this one, you can see I actually have the bass pretty high for me at 4 out of 10. And then the treble I have at 6.5. And then the volumes I have pretty loud, and I have this on a preset. Now, a lot of these solid state or digital amps, because I think this is just a modeling amp, so it's completely digital. It has a bunch of presets, and so what I did, and a kind of a good starting point, is just to go through the different presets and hear if one of them maybe sounds good to you. They all might sound bad to you, and then you got to just start kind of build it from the ground up. But I found one that I was like, this is close, and then I tweaked it from there. So I got one that was really clean. So if you listen, I'm just gonna turn all my pedals off. Just clean, sounds normal, right? If I go to my bridge pickup, same thing. Now, the problem with this tone that I have, and I noticed it right away. Now, this amp is faced away from me, which makes it kind of hard to hear. It's pretty boomy.
Yeah.
It's too much bass for what I would go for in a tone. So when I'm playing clean and by myself, if let's say, I'm just gonna kick on this compressor and this clean boost just so that I have. That sounds good to me on my own, right? I like the sound of that, but if I was playing in a band, all of a sudden all that low end is just gonna start eating up frequencies that the bass guitar is eating up and stuff like that, and it's just gonna sound washy and muddy, and there's gonna be no articulation, especially on the bass player's end. So what I would actually do is I would just take that, I'd probably back it down maybe to there. It's pretty bright, but I actually like the sound of like a really bright, especially like on this Telly style bridge pickup. I like that sound. It might be a little bit bright now that I've taken the bass down. So I'm just gonna pull the treble down a little bit. I'm gonna bring the bass just back up a little bit. And let's see what we got. That is a totally usable and workable tone, right? And it's not that loud. I do have it kind of cranked for what this amp is.
That's only to keep up with this other amp.
Exactly, yeah. Tearing my face off. But what I can do when I have an amp set up like this, and this is the way that I like to set stuff up, is I can use pedals to get other tones. So literally right now I have things set up clean. I kick on an overdrive. Now the problem is these overdrives aren't really designed to work with the solid state or modeling amp as well, so it's not gonna sound the way that I like it to when it's playing in front of a 2 amp, but that's perfectly okay. But this kind of gives me at least my starting tone, and I know like, okay, I can do more bassy, kind of like more treble-y stuff when I'm playing on my own. It sounds good in the room, it sounds fine, especially if I'm gonna like sing and play maybe electric guitar together. Oh, it sounds cool to have that bassy stuff happening. But if I'm gonna play in a band, okay, I'm gonna roll that bass off, I'm gonna maybe bring the treble back a little bit. It's gonna depend. You can have bright sounding guitars, that's okay. People in country have been doing it forever, right? That twangy, snappy stuff. But really just be thinking about what the other people are doing and just use your ears. You can really, like, even if you're not an expert, you can listen to what, if Nate and I were both playing together and we were both playing in a band, I would listen to what he plays and I would go, okay, his tone, the tone he's going for sounds kind of like this. You know what, I'm gonna go for something that's kind of doing my own thing so that when we play at the same time, if we're playing different parts, people can really pick out both parts at the same time. Because if we sound the exact same, a lot of the stuff we play is just gonna kind of get mushed together and sound the same, if that kind of makes sense.
You answered somebody's question in the chat. That's awesome. Let's talk about what about singing and playing at the same time with electric. So there you go.
Well, there you go.
Another question was, what amps are we using? That's a Fender Mustang 1. I just rented it from the local music store. This is a PV Classic 30.
Yes,
cool.
Exactly. These aren't the normal setups we would normally use.
No.
Normally you use your Helix, right?
Helix, yeah. If I have a gig where I can't use Go Direct, I would use this. So.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
Cool. Let's see. Now the last kind of area that I wanted to address before the last one, quickly, because I want to get to questions, because I know there are already some in there, is just basically tubes or modeling versus solid state. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. The biggest advantage to tube amps is the tone. They just sound so good and organic and three-dimensional.
Yeah.
The disadvantages, you have to maintain them, and you have to carry them. They are heavy. I hate that. That's why I go direct so much with like a Helix. I want to buy a Kemper too. That's my main reasoning. And like the biggest advantage to me for a solid state amp or modeling amp is you get a catch-all. You can find something that's decent for any style of music that you want just by doing this, right? Just by flicking a knob. And they're lightweight. Generally, you don't have to maintain them unless something catastrophic goes wrong with them, like a power surge or you drop them. Yep. They're going to last a really long time. So those are the advantages. Also, it's not really the case anymore because this amp I got on clearance for $500.
Yeah,
brand new.
It's affordable.
But I think new was like $8.
Okay.
And I think those new are like what, $299, $200, something like that.
Yes, around that.
But I wouldn't say that's equivalent. I would say an equivalent solid state amp to this would be $400 or $500 new.
Yeah.
Without not being discounted.
Yeah, I would agree.
The tube amps stereotypically are a little bit more expensive.
And that does happen. Like it becomes exponential at some point, right? Like the best tube amp stuff gets just $5,000, $10,000.
Yeah, exactly. And the best solid state amp you can get is what, maybe $1,000?
$1,000, yeah.
Except for unless you're doing like jazz stuff.
Yeah, they have some very specific ways of doing things. Yeah.
Cool. That's it. So if you're wondering, do I go solid state or do I go tube? Where are you playing it? Are you playing it just at home where you can never crank it up? Solid modeling amp might be the best for you, right? Plus, you get things like digital outs on a lot of. Although tube amps are starting to do that now. You get headphone outs on modeling amps, things like that. They're lighter, and you get, I'd say, a wider palette at your fingertips, and that you can especially experiment with and find out what different amps sound like and what different effects sound like, which leads me to my last point before we get to questions, and that is experiment and research. The only way that you're gonna find your tone that you like is to experiment. And that's important because it's really an extension of who you are and what you like, which is really cool. It's a fun journey to go on and mess around with tones, experiment, and find out what you like. And one way to do that, I'm not saying to copy people, is to try to emulate and research what your favorite players are using. So you might take a piece from that player or whatever and use it as part of your overall tone. But experiment and come up with your own unique voice that you like.
Absolutely. That's so true, because that's literally how I arrived at a lot of my tone decisions, and it kind of then developed into its own thing. And now it's like, oh, nobody plays the exact same rig as I do, right? I kind of have my own thing going on based on my influence. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
That's all I have to say.
Okay. We have some questions in here already.
Excellent.
You guys can feel free to shoot those over if you have more questions.
Oh, shoot.
We've got the question box underneath.
Yeah, we finally got that fixed and a new way of implementing that. So
everything should be all good to go. Okay, so first question here. This one is from T. Franklin. What are all the knobs on the amp supposed to do? I have a Fender Mustang 4, and I understand that the volume, gain, treble, reverb, and bass do, but as far as middle, master, intensity, and speed, I'm not sure. Okay. Also, if you can answer a question about the knobs on chorus modulation, thanks.
Okay.
I know what they do. Okay. Do you know what they do?
Yeah.
They should be trem.
Trem?
So specifically intensity and speed should be tremolo.
Right.
Most of the time, that's what that's in.
Or it can be
any kind of modulation multiple effects. Yeah. Right. Because intensity and speed was kind of like a classic thing on the actual tube trem stuff. That was kind of like the old settings. So let's go through them again. So you know all those, but as far as middle, middle is something we talked about, right?
I will demonstrate that for you. Here you go. Let's see. I'm going to crank my mid all the way down, and I'm going to turn back to my clean channel. This may be pretty subtle.
It's all the body.
It's almost like body. Yeah, it's the perfect word that I was going to use. Okay, so here's your sound spectrum. Here are the lows. Here are the highs or the treble, and here is the middle. So if you took out the mids, you would scoop the bottom out, and you'd lose a lot of the body, which by itself, like Andrew was saying, doesn't sound bad if you're playing by yourself. But as soon as you get in the context of the band situation, you're not going to be able to hear yourself. So you're always going to want some mids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's like the first go-to is like, crank those mids.
Master, I think, is the second one. That's your overall volume. That's going to, on a solid state amp like that, it's going to affect your volume without affecting the gain of your sound. And on something like a Mustang, it's probably going to affect, like if you have an auxiliary in for a CD input or MP3 input, it's going to affect the volume of that and your guitar, I would imagine.
It's literally the overall volume of everything. The other volumes do affect volume, but they're more interactive with one another. The master volume is kind of like its own separate big volume knob. Imagine it being like this big
the
thing that just
gatekeeper
turns everything.
for the
Exactly.
volume.
That's a good way of thinking about it, actually. It's the very last thing. And then intensity and speed are going to be about your effects. A lot of times with trem is kind of the one that at least I know that was like the traditional one, and I can actually show you quick what it does.
Yeah.
So this is literally says intensity and speed. So if I turn it on, if I have the intensity halfway and the speed halfway,
You hear the warble?
wah, 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 right? I turn the speed up,
It's faster.
speed down.
It's like a Leslie.
It is a little bit, isn't it? And then intensity, if I turn it down, the effect disappears. Turn it up, it becomes really exaggerated. So turn it up.
Sounds nervous.
It does. But that's usually, so if it's in regards to that, it could be in regards to chorus too. That's another thing. And you did mention, I'm not quite sure, and also if you can answer a question about the knobs on chorus and other types of modulation. So chorus is basically, if I'm thinking about this correct, it takes your signal and it detunes it, right? And it makes it come in and out of the same, not frequency, tone.
Yeah,
right?
it's if you've ever heard somebody record vocals, like singing a line, and they double it and record it twice, they're not always going to be on the same pitch. So it makes it sound thicker and like they're kind of two people singing, and that's kind of the effect that it gives your guitar. It just thickens it up and makes it, I don't know, I guess that's the best word. It makes it a little more thicker.
It's not used very often in modern music. It was really big in the 80s, still around in the 90s, and then after that, it kind of died off. People don't use it as much. But as a throwback, it's a great little effect.
No, I have a chorus ensemble pedal sitting right there for cover gigs.
Yep, but that's the only use, right? Yep. Sounds really cool on clean sounds.
I do like it.
Yeah, that's usually what most people use it for.
It almost like if you have your sound coming through your amp, it's right here. But when you put chorus on it, it widens it a little bit, it sounds like to me. So.
Yeah. Okay, next question here. This is a bunch of acronyms, but I think I can figure it out. Taekwondo Black Belt 3. I recently got an electric guitar and a Fender Champ 20 amp. Awesome. It only has one channel, so how do I know if it's on a clean or dirty setting? I assume just turn the gain knob down to the lowest setting. Also, can you explain the different voicing settings to us beginners? Thank you. Okay. I'm assuming voicings is just different EQ settings.
Was it Fender Champion 20? I'm gonna look it up while
Yeah,
you
look it up. I would guess that it basically has like different, maybe like mid frequency, but like on like a click knob or something like that.
I think I know what he's talking about.
Something like that would be like, oh, is it something else you think?
No,
Does
keep
that sound
going.
right? Okay.
I think you're right.
As far as single channel amps, I exclusively use one channel amps. I do not like amps with a dirty channel. I like them to be clean, and as I turn them up, they stay clean. And then as they get super loud, then they start to get dirtier and dirtier and dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. So that's one thing with a single channel amp, that's how it works. You have volume down here, and it works the same way as basically an overdrive being turned up at the same time. So unfortunately, you don't have them being exclusive from one another, and that's typical even of a clean channel on an amp. You continue to crank it, it will eventually get dirty. What was the...
It's like modeling tech. On that particular amp, it's like modeling technology. It's blackface, modern, whatever, British.
Okay.
Yeah.
So blackface is like the traditional 60s Fender amps.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the penultimate clean tone.
Yeah.
A lot of people love those sounds. I was like, the Stevie Ray Vaughan tone comes from that. Some Jimmy era stuff was on that. Tons of the classic sounds you hear still are played. People they're very sought after.
Yeah.
And then like British is based on like Marshalls and Voxes, which not always more high gain necessarily, but they're like a different sound. They usually have like less low ends. They have a chimier top end, and usually more mids than blackface stuff.
And same thing goes for these like Fender Mustangs. As like if you start here with your amp models or voices and go down, it's just going to go through the cycle of really clean,
Usually, yeah.
a little bit dirty, aggressive, metal all the way down. So I think on that one it was something like tweed, blackface, British, metal, and it's just from clean to dirty.
Okay.
Different voicings.
One thing I will mention is in most cases, tweed is dirtier than blackface. So just keep that in mind, which sounds kind of backwards, but they were in the 50s. The tweed era of Fenders were in the 50s, and it just has to do with the covering on them, but they were a different circuit. And the blackface era came later, and those were the cleanest, basically the cleanest circuits that basically ever existed.
I think of when I think of a tweed, I think of a Bassman. When I think of a blackface, I think of a deluxe. Fender Deluxe. So.
Yeah, I'm a little bit different. I think of a Tweed Deluxe, and I think of a Blackface Super Reverb.
Okay,
Those are my.
Cool.
Anyways, I hope that explains things. Fender 20 is an awesome amp. The 20 Champions.
That's a good practice amp.
Yeah, it's awesome. S. Resler, when setting your amp, where do you preset your guitar at?
It depends on what I'm doing. Generally, I set my amp up to where my guitar is just cranked. And
Okay.
If it depends on if I'm playing mellow music or if I'm playing something more country or like that, I'll use the bridge pickup. If I want something more mellow, other than I'll use the neck pickup. But that's really irrelevant, and it really depends on what amp I'm using. Like for this amp, it's just on the clean channel. If it was on my Mesa Boogie, I would have this channel kind of pushed.
Right.
Again, right? Then have the option. But that's the difference between me and Andrew. I like having the option to have all the gain on the amp on another channel, but before that, I have to have a clean channel that I can push.
Right.
That's more important.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, I usually, when I'm setting stuff, I just crank everything. I usually take my tone back like 1, and then take my volume back 1, and then do all of my my pedal setup and my amp, make everything sound good like that. And then it allows me to have like some wiggle room. So like, I can go up just a tiny bit. It's usually not volume, it's just usually more gain.
Yeah,
That's usually what I do.
Normally have the gain set just a little bit. That's a little bit gainy for what I would normally do. So something, and if I need to clean it up, I'll just back off on my volume. But
Right. All right, next question. This one's from Bearcat Bright. Hi, Nate and Andrew. I own a Mesa Boogie F52 amp.
oh, I own an F30. Awesome.
I see one in the background in your studio. I imagine that is for your gigs. I know I have too much amp for my little music room, but that's what I have. Hey, it's a good problem to have.
Yes,
to
it
be
is.
honest. I play a Fender Strat Elite and a Gibson Studio 339 through it. Very nice guitars. I do find that I have to turn the master way down. I also have a couple little practice amps. I find that I can get some nice sounds with this amp, as I also have effects pedals. I just can't turn it up much. Am I missing some nice guitar sounds because my amp is too big for my room? Should I consider getting a smaller amp for my little music room in the future? Thanks.
That's a tough question. That's a really personal question. You want to tell them about your attenuator?
Yeah, I would suggest investing in an attenuator. Basically what happens is an attenuator, you have to make sure you buy one that's compatible with your amplifier. Pretty much everyone should be. It's basically just based on like, is it too many watts for the attenuator? But what it does is it goes in between the output of your amplifier and your speaker. So after everything goes through your amp, it comes out through a speaker cable into your speaker. You're putting this thing in between the amplifier and the speaker. And what it does is it actually takes the volume and dissipates it as heat. And a lot of them can actually attenuate insane amounts of volume. I know mine, I use like one that's a little bit more crude. It's just got like 5 presets. It's the one Dr. Z makes, but like the lower end one that they mount inside the amps. So it's not as, I can't get quite as quiet, but it knocks like 14 dB or something like that, which is pretty significant.
That's cool.
But there's some out there, you can get them from anywhere from like $200 to like $2,000. But they literally will allow you to still crank your amp way up, but it's almost like a master volume before it hits the speaker. It's still not gonna sound like as amazing because part of an amp sounding good is the speaker compressing as well. But that's probably your best option.
Cool. If you can afford it, just buy another smaller wattage tube amp, I would say. And you know, appreciate the times you get to crank that up. The only time I crank that up is when I'm here practicing. That's it.
Okay, that's fair. I would say get an attenuator instead, but that would just be me.
Both. Get both.
Get both.
If you can.
Yeah, oh, totally. Okay, next question here. I have seen some artists use a microphone in front of their amp. What are specific situations that it would be necessary to use a microphone with your amp if you have a good amp already?
Anytime you have a PA that's worth a darn, and anytime you need to get over a drummer for volume, I'd say.
A big problem, guitar amplifiers aren't actually meant to be like loudspeakers in the way that they're being mixed as you turning up your volume is what's being mixed out front. What happens is you put a microphone in front of it, and then it's spread to all the speakers in the PA system, and then they can mix it nicely so it fits in with everything else, so it doesn't sound like everything is here being mixed together, and then your guitar is coming shooting out of one single speaker right here. So if someone moves in front of it, it's super loud, and they move to the side, and it disappears, right? So that's the idea. And especially like, as you get onto bigger stages, guitar amps just aren't loud enough. Especially you get a ton of bodies in a room, even a crazy loud amp,
It's very
cranked up,
directional,
it actually, it's very directional, and all of a sudden it just disappears. So that's why. We actually have microphones on our amps in here.
Yeah, same mics on both of them, so equal.
Yep, exactly. Okay, next one here. This one is from C Drive. Are acoustic amps a whole different animal? If so, can you do a lesson on acoustic amps?
Sure, we can. We can make that happen. They are very different. Very, very different. Like the only people I've ever seen run electric guitars through acoustic amps are jazz players because they want the natural acoustic sound of their guitar. They just want to make it louder, right?
What about acoustic guitars through acoustic amps?
Yeah.
I don't like them. They're not for me. They're not my thing. It's just not. I like when I have an acoustic guitar, I want to mic it, or if I absolutely have to, DI out of use the electronics. Basically, what an acoustic amp is, it's basically a PA system and a DI box rolled into one thing. So basically, they're taking a DI from your guitar's electric system inside of the acoustic guitar, and they're just converting it and sending it out through a speaker. They can sound really good. I just find like the function is so limited.
Yeah, I like them for like at home, having fun. That's about it.
Exactly.
Other than that, I'd rather go direct into a PA.
And then a follow-up question from C Drive here, and I should say, I'm just saying for me personally and my uses.
I owned one. I owned a Trace Elliott, and it sounded fantastic at home.
Yeah.
But other than that, I never used it.
Yeah. Follow-up question from C Drive. Am I wrong in thinking that maximum flexibility would be achieved with a really good clean amp and a bunch of high-level pedals?
It depends what you're doing. I think
the short answer is yes.
I don't know, because I could have a wall full of amplifiers and get more stuff, or just as much. It's probably the cheapest way.
Yes. The thing is like, it's like I was saying before, is like, you can get one thing that just sounds so good at that one thing, but you're gonna sacrifice in other ways. That's basically what I do, is I use one clean amp and I get all my kind of sounds from pedals, boosting things and kind of doing things like that. I can't get an amazing high gain sound. If I bought a really nice high gain pedal, I could get a good high gain sound. It's not gonna sound good as like dual rectifier cranked for that style of music, right? It's not gonna sound like a Bogner or something like that.
And it depends what you're doing. If you're playing live, you need those things. Like you need your setup for your style of music you're doing.
Yes.
You need a boogie rectifier if you're in a metal band for that.
You do.
That's the only way around it, right? That's why I'm such a big fan of stuff like the Helix and the Kemper. It does everything good enough to where nobody but me or maybe Andrew in my life is going to be able to notice.
That's literally, and that's so true. Like especially nowadays, the modeling has come so far. There's tons like the Axe FX, the Fractal one, the Helix, and then the Kemper are kind of like the top dogs in that space. They're all very cool. Okay, we got 2 more questions.
Bam.
David L. Basic settings for 12-bar blues.
It depends what guitar you have. Like this would probably be where I would live for this guitar. Let me see. Yeah. For the Strat, it wouldn't even be anywhere close to this. It'd probably be the exact same thing. I would have cranked the treble down a little bit, or a lot, and then have the bass and the mids up a little more for like a Tele or a Strat or something. But I find that I keep a pretty neutral sound on my guitar. Then, like if I need to change it, I use pedals or the knobs on the guitar.
I would say really use your ears. There's no kind of like one trick way to these settings are gonna get you the perfect sound. I would say try and go for something really balanced, get a little bit of overdrive on there, but mainly like something that's sounding kind of like clean and articulate and not too dirty. I mean, if I just, even this is perfectly fine.
Yeah. You have to find out what you like.
Like that's perfectly fine.
Sounds good,
right?
yeah.
That's perfectly fine. You do, and that's the thing is like for 12-bar blues, like you think about Joe Bonamassa versus like Stevie Ray Vaughan versus like the stuff Jimmy did versus the stuff BB did. Like Albert King's stuff is completely different.
Really different. Yeah.
It's like you can go so many directions. It's really just about finding that voice and that kind of way that you want to sound personally.
I've owned over 50 guitars and I only own 10 right now. 9.
Holy smokes.
Just because I was
I
blowing
only
through
own
it,
10.
thinking that okay, if I get a different guitar, it's going to satisfy me. I didn't know what I liked. This is the bottom line.
Yeah.
So.
I moved through a lot of gear as well. I don't have as many guitars as me, but I moved through a lot of gear. And then the last question here. This one is from Daryl S. What do you mean by going direct?
I would assume he means for acoustic.
Because we mentioned going direct.
acoustic electric guitars or acoustic guitars with pickup systems in them, you can put a guitar cable in them, go right out to a direct box, which is just kind of a interface to get things proper for going directly into a PA or a public address system, right? At your church or at a concert, at a coffee house or whatever. So you just go direct input from your guitar into the direct box via a mic cable into the mixing board.
A preamp or mixing board. So the thing is that you can't just take a guitar cable and just plug it into a mixing board. It doesn't work. So you need something that converts that signal. I think it has to be converted from like a line, what is it?
Instrument to line?
Instrument to like a balance something. I don't know. That's not really my thing. But that direct box is what does it. You can actually get them for like super cheap. But they're literally necessary for you to be able to convert your signal from an acoustic guitar. You can actually do it with an electric guitar too. It sounds pretty bad, but you can do that as well.
Cool. All right.
Okay, that's it for questions. Let me just check the chat and make sure I'm not missing anything.
Check. This is the longest live lesson we've done in a while, but I wanted to make sure to get all those points and questions in.
The Mustang one is $120.
Oh, there you go.
Perfect. I use a Fender 65 Deluxe for the blue. Oh, come on. A 65 Deluxe and a 69 Custom Strat.
Like,
that's a good setup. That's a very classic setup. Throw a tube screamer in that.
That's pretty gross
baby.
in a good way.
Okay, let's play out. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to make a post in the forums. I love talking about this kind of stuff, so I'll be there. Let me just tune up really fast. Nate, if you want to make another public address.
I just, was it yesterday that we just put up the Caged 1 series in the Guitareo members area. So if you're a member, go check that out. I know a lot of you have been waiting on that for a long time. And if you don't know what the cage sequence is, it's going to revolutionize the way you think about the layout of the guitar, and it's going to help you not get lost on the guitar when you're either playing rhythm or lead guitar. So
right.
Cool. All right, what are we doing?
I'm going to play this thing, and you're going to play over it.
All right.